By the 4th century BC, the shadow of Confucius had lingered over the landscape for more than 100 years. Yet the empire did not heal, and it continued to bleed. The battles for hegemony among rival sovereigns had escalated into violent wars of annexation. These campaigns were driven by a brutal ambition to completely erase neighboring states from the map. This was the exact historical moment that a child named Mencius was born. History would come to know this boy by his revered title, Mencius. His birthplace was the state of Zhou, which is known today as Zhusheng in Shandong. Mencius lost his father at the age of 3, and his mother raised him entirely on her own. Out of this childhood experience emerged the defining core of his entire life, a profound sense of responsibility and mission. This journey is preserved in the celebrated story of his mother moving their home 3 times to secure an environment of virtue. Their first home bordered a cemetery. The young Mencius quickly began to imitate the rituals of grief, and he spent his days practicing the weeping, burying, and mournful performances of funerals. His mother observed this and stated that this was no place to raise her son. They relocated to the edge of a market. In this new environment, the child quickly picked up the habits of traders, learning the loud hawking and the art of haggling over prices. Again, his mother rejected the environment and declared it unfit for his growth. Their third move brought them to the vicinity of an academy. There, Mencius watched scholars practice their classical rituals, bowing and yielding to one another with profound respect. He immediately began to copy their conduct. Only then did his mother find peace, and she said that this was truly the right place for her son. This story may not be a piece of strictly verified history, but the underlying reality it reflects is undeniable. From his earliest days, his mother taught him a fundamental truth. One's environment dictates one's worldview, and that worldview ultimately dictates who one will become. At around 15 years of age, Mencius entered his formal education and studied under the disciples of Zisi. Through this connection, he established his place in the direct academic lineage of Confucius. This lineage ran from the Grand Master to Zhengzi, then to Zisi, down to Zisi's disciples, and finally to Mencius himself. Scholars like Han Yu would heavily emphasize this sacred chain of Confucian tradition over a millennium later. Mencius completed his studies, but he did not choose the conventional path of a scholarly teacher. He chose a far more hazardous road, just as Confucius had done before him. He decided to travel outward into the world. He wanted to see if this shattered society was still salvageable. Above all, he sought out rulers to test if any conscience remained on the throne. Mencius made his first major public appearance with an intense intellectual confrontation. The historical classic known as the Book of Mencius opens directly with his conversation with King Hui of Liang. The king looked upon his royal park filled with wild geese and deer, and he immediately posed a direct question to the arriving philosopher. He asked the old master why he had traveled over 1,000 miles, and eagerly inquired what high opinions he brought to profit the kingdom. This was a perfectly normal inquiry for a ruler who carried the survival of his state on his shoulders. However, the blunt reply from Mencius immediately shattered the conventions of the court. Mencius asked the king why he must speak of profit at all, declaring that benevolence and justice were all that truly mattered. This exchange created a staggering conceptual collision. Imagine hiring a modern business consultant to maximize profits. When asked how to increase corporate revenue, the consultant responds that money does not matter, urging the executives to focus strictly on their conscience instead. This was the exact scenario that left King Hui completely bewildered. Mencius operated on a completely different systemic logic. He believed that if every individual from the monarch to the minister chased only personal advantage, the moral fabric of society would dissolve from within, and the state would collapse. His formula dictated that when a ruler prioritizes moral duty, practical prosperity follows as a natural byproduct. A king who genuinely cares for his populace does not need to obsess over continuous financial calculation. This uncompromising stance defined the signature style of Mencius. Historians like Ray Huan have noted a profound psychological contrast between Confucius and his intellectual heir. Confucius maintained a sense of light-hearted ease, whereas Mencius was permanently defined by a state of intense urgency. Confucius could leisurely discuss the idyllic pleasures of a spring excursion with his disciples. Mencius spoke only of warnings and immediate crisis, famously declaring that thrive in calamity and perish in soft living. Confucius might complain if his food was improperly prepared, Mencius directly weaponized the luxury of the court against the ruler, accusing kings of feeding fat meat to their palace horses, while ordinary people died of hunger in the wilderness. Mencius lacked the smooth, jade-like gentleness of Confucius. Instead, he possessed a fiercely defensive and prickly moral righteousness. He refused to flatter rulers, he refused to use diplomatic euphemisms, and he chose to speak only the raw truth as he saw it, even when he sat directly across from absolute monarchs. Furthermore, Mencius lacked the patience for traditional court etiquette that Confucius held in such high regard. Confucius would maintain polite customs, even with rivals he disliked. Mencius rejected such diplomatic games entirely. When King Xuan of Qi feigned an illness to avoid an audience, Mencius immediately feigned his own illness to snub the king in return. After a brief meeting with King Shang of Liang, Mencius walked out and openly told others that the man looked nothing like a true sovereign. In a modern workplace, such a relentlessly defiant individual would be dismissed within 3 days. Yet this exact willingness to challenge the throne made Mencius an extraordinary force in the intellectual landscape of the Warring States period. He never sought the favor of rulers through submission. Instead, he used his sharp intellect and relentless rhetoric to force rulers into deep moral self-reflection. The departure of Confucius left a massive theoretical vacuum that a brutal century of warfare quickly filled with blood and iron. In this desperate era of total war, moral arguments were routinely mocked by rulers who demanded immediate lethal efficiency. The grand framework of self-cultivation and ritual was on the verge of collapsing under the sheer weight of military violence. Mencius entered the intellectual arena, knowing that a soft appeal to virtue was no longer enough. He had to forge an aggressive, bulletproof baseline for Confucian thought. The first line of defense in this intellectual armor was the theory of the inherent goodness of human nature. Before Mencius, thinkers debated the fundamental core of humanity with chaotic and cynical results. Some argued that human nature was a blank slate, entirely devoid of inherent good or evil. Others claimed it was malleable like clay, turning toward virtue or violence depending purely on external manipulation. The most pessimistic asserted that humans were born into a rigid hierarchy, where some were destined to be sages and others were inherently irredeemable. Mencius identified a fatal vulnerability within this chaotic spectrum of psychological skepticism. If the core of human identity was reduced to a blank slate or a piece of malleable clay, then human morality possessed no cosmic justification. If human consciousness possessed no innate, inevitable gravity toward goodness, then humanity had no logical reason to restrain its own destructive impulses. If the committing of atrocities were seen merely as the natural output of a blank slate, the entire project of civilization would dissolve into a meaningless farce of artificial constraint. All ethical teachings, philosophical contemplation, and cultural rituals would lose their ultimate legitimacy. The response from Mencius was absolute. He delivered a definitive statement that shifted the gravity of Chinese philosophy, declaring that the inclination of human nature toward goodness is as absolute as the downward flow of water, meaning that no human is born devoid of virtue, just as no water fails to seek the lower ground. In his ideological architecture, this moral baseline behaves like an inescapable spiritual anchor. These original sprouts of goodness require relentless internal cultivation. Those who actively shield these psychological seeds from the corrosive dust of material desire will allow them to mature into universal virtues, while those who abandon this inner vigilance allow their moral consciousness to be completely buried by the brutal anxiety of survival. To transform this abstract philosophical proposition into an undeniable intuition, Mencius presented a famous thought experiment. He described a scenario where a person suddenly witnesses a young child crawling toward the edge of a deep well, on the absolute verge of falling. In that split second, any ordinary bystander experiences an immediate impulse of alarm and compassion. The bystander does not pause to calculate whether the parents will reward the rescue, nor do they evaluate whether the act will enhance their reputation among the political elite. The flash of shock, empathy, and the physical instinct to run forward represents a pure impulse that completely bypasses rational self-interest. Mencius defined this instinctual compassion as the original spark of human goodness. Mencius categorized this moral instinct into 4 distinct psychological seeds. The feeling of compassion is the seed of benevolence. The feeling of shame and dislike is the seed of righteousness. The feeling of modesty and deference is the seed of propriety. The feeling of right and wrong is the seed of wisdom. These four baseline systems define humanity itself. Nurturing these seeds allows an ordinary person to become a sage, while destroying them reduces a human to the level of a beast. This argument marked a monumental transformation in Chinese intellectual history, providing the ultimate metaphysical foundation for why humanity is obligated to be moral. Before Mencius, the Confucian school leaned heavily on historical precedents and social contracts to justify its codes of conduct. Mencius deployed an unyielding idealist logic to answer this existential question, shifting the source of morality from external tribal enforcement to the sovereign territory of internal human nature. Committing evil was no longer a natural state, but rather a deliberate act of self-mutilation against one's own sacred identity. Armed with this metaphysical armor, Mencius unleashed his second doctrinal weapon to assault the structural paradigm of the warring states: the political system of benevolent governance. Benevolent governance was never an exercise in palace-bound sentimentality. Mencius designed a concrete blueprint for state administration, known as the Way of the King, which stood in direct opposition to the Way of the Hegemon, the popular method of military conquest and diplomatic intrigue. In the eyes of Mencius, the famous hegemons of the past were merely clever players of political chess and state violence. Their rule relied on fear, which inevitably triggered endless arms races and eventual collapse. Conversely, the legendary King Wen of Zhou conquered hearts through pure virtue, causing neighboring states to align with him voluntarily, without a single deployment of troops. Mencius demanded that the bloodstained kings of the warring states discard their utilitarian balance sheets and win the populace through pure compassion. He warned rulers that a king who truly possesses an empathetic heart cannot bear the innocent suffering of his people. Such a king naturally reduces the crushing taxes designed to fund permanent warfare, allowing exhausted farmers to rest and cultivate their fields according to the seasons. Mencius argued that a populace rooted in permanent property is inherently immune to desperate criminality. Only when economic security eliminates the immediate terror of starvation can a society foster a collective conscience and genuinely comprehend the architecture of shame and ritual. To operationalize this doctrine, Mencius constantly weaponized history, contrasting the bloody expansionist autocrats of his day with the near-mythic archetypes of King Yao, King Shan, and King Wen of Zhou. By measuring contemporary warlords against the absolute moral clarity of these ancient standard-bearers, Mencius exposed the celebrated achievements of warring states' rulers as mere short-sighted acts of geopolitical plunder. Yet, the intellectual legacy that granted Mencius his enduring subversiveness across millennia was his third and most volatile philosophical rupture, a doctrine declaring that the populace holds the highest value, the state follows, and the monarch weighs the least. This single sentence detonated like an intellectual bomb within an era of absolute monarchical power. In a world that viewed ordinary people as mere expendable resources on a battlefield, Mencius ruthlessly inverted the pyramid of authority. He asserted that the people are the foundation of true value, the political mechanisms of the state are secondary, and the ruler is the most transient and expendable of all. A monarch who protects the people remains a legitimate ruler, but a monarch who destroys the people loses his mandate entirely, becoming a tyrant whom the populace has every right to overthrow. The autocratic rulers of the warring states viewed this inversion with profound existential horror. To a ruling class that demanded unquestioning obedience as a cosmic right, the notion that a monarch occupied the lowest stratum of structural value was an unforgivable ideological treason. Yet Mencius refused to recalibrate his language in the face of this systemic institutional outrage. Instead, he neutralized their outrage by deploying a chillingly precise law of political reciprocity. He declared that if a ruler treats the populace like hands and feet, they will view the ruler as their own heart. If a ruler treats them like hounds and horses, they will view the ruler as a common stranger. If a ruler treats them like mud and weeds, they will look upon that ruler as an absolute enemy. This concept of mutual obligation shattered any distortion of Confucianism that demanded blind, unconditional loyalty to the throne. Throughout the subsequent centuries of imperial rule, absolute monarchs consistently tried to dull the edge of this doctrine. Through censorship and selective interpretation, rulers preferred to emphasize the loyalty of the servant, while ignoring the prerequisite benevolence of the master. Yet the words remained unalterable on the ancient bamboo scrolls, preserving an inherent defiance that no imperial strategy could ever fully erase. The biography of Mencius is a magnificent chronicle, a history of sublime failure. He journeyed across a fractured homeland, traveling from one war-torn state to another throughout the Central Plains, entering the courts of Qi, Song, Tang, and Lu, and confronting the legendary autocrats of the age, including King Zhuan of Qi and King Hui of Liang. He presented each sovereign with a choice. Yet every encounter yielded the same existential paralysis. The rulers offered him immense institutional reverence, acknowledged the pristine inner logic of his philosophy, and ultimately rejected its practical execution. This structural deadlock was born of a fundamental civilizational contradiction. The strategic blueprint of Mencius required a steadfast commitment to the cultivation of the people, reducing taxes, securing the livelihood of the peasantry, and prioritizing the economic sovereignty of the common individual over the expansion of the state. Yet within the zero-sum arena of the warring states, immediate survival demanded immediate extraction, while the ruthless, legalist reforms of Shangyang in Qin delivered instant military supremacy through draconian laws and total mobilization. The compassionate architecture of Mencius required generations to mature. For monarchs trapped in a permanent panic of imminent annihilation, the luxury of patience was a path to geopolitical suicide. Yet Mencius refused to compromise his doctrine to accommodate the anxieties of kings. In a world of unchecked cruelty, the state of Tang stood as a rare sanctuary of hope. Its ruler Duke Wen was deeply moved by the Confucian vision and genuinely sought a better path for his people. He personally turned to Mencius for guidance on how to govern, and Mencius provided him with practical measures to reduce crushing taxes and protect the livelihood of the peasantry. Historical records reveal that when these benevolent policies were implemented, the impact was immediate. Exhausted by war and starvation, countless families from neighboring states packed their meager belongings and fled into Tang. They fled not for political alignment or geographic advantage, but because they yearned for a ruler who treated them with basic dignity. This mass migration proved that the desire for a peaceful moral society was a powerful reality. Yet the tragedy of history remains unyielding. Tang was a small nation, densely populated but physically vulnerable. Trapped in the crossfire between the massive military empires of Qi and Chu, Mencius was not defeated by a flaw in his principles, but by the overwhelming brutality of an iron century that crushed any state ruled by conscience. His tenure in the kingdom of Qi marked the most illustrious period of his life. King Zhuan of Qi had assembled the finest scholars of the realm at the Jixia Academy, sustaining a formidable brain trust with lavish stipends. Upon his arrival, Mencius engaged in profound lectures and fierce intellectual debates within the academy, eventually being honored with the exalted rank of a state minister. Yet despite this immense prestige, he was never granted actual executive decision-making power. Qi offered him high dignity, but denied him the opportunity of political practice. In his twilight years, Mencius finally chose to step away from the political stage. Returning to his native state of Zhu, he collaborated with his close disciples, including Wan Zhang and Gongsun Shu, to commit his lifelong philosophy to the bamboo scrolls, forging the text known as the Mencius. This masterpiece departs drastically from the style of the Analects. While Confucius expressed his wisdom through brief, subtle, and aphoristic maxims, the Mencius operates as a grand arena of intellectual combat, driven by long-form dialogue and rigorous debate. The text moves fluidly through structured cross-examinations and multi-layered ideological offensives. To read its pages is to review the live transcripts of high-stakes debates. Here, history remembers Mencius as he truly was, a born debater and a master polemicist. Comprising a mere 7 chapters and roughly 34,000 characters, this compact intellectual legacy would ultimately endure, to become one of the most foundational and definitive texts in the history of East Asian thought. Paradoxically, Mencius enjoyed far less reverence during his lifetime than even Confucius, achieving none of the direct political authority his predecessor had occasionally wielded. While Confucius once served as the Grand Minister of Justice in the state of Lu, Mencius never held the reins of executive power in any state. As the Grand Historian Sima Qian observed in the records of the Grand Historian, while the state of Qin employed Shengyang, and Chu utilized Wu Qi to successfully enrich their states and strengthen their militaries. Mencius traveled from court to court preaching the archaic golden age of the legendary emperors Yao, Shun, and Yu. To his contemporary rulers, engulfed in the fires of survival, his doctrines were dismissed as pedantic, detached, and utterly impractical. Following his death, his standing did not experience an immediate resurrection, even when the Han dynasty officially banished all competing schools of thought to honor Confucianism alone. The intellectual prestige of Zunzi eclipsed that of Mencius for centuries. The reason was pragmatic. Zunzi's philosophy emphasized the joint implementation of ritual and law, a framework that perfectly serviced the imperial demands of a unified Han Empire, which required both moral indoctrination and legal coercion. Mencius, with his radical assertion that the people outranked the sovereign, was inherently unpalatable to an autocracy. Thus, while Han scholars revered his contemporary as Minister Zun, the historical influence of Mencius remained a shadow of what it would eventually become. The true breakthrough in his historical elevation was ignited in the mid-Tang dynasty by the literary master Han Yu. Deeply alarmed by the rise of Buddhism and Taoism, which he believed were eroding the foundational architecture of Chinese civilization through their doctrines of worldly renunciation and non-action, Han Yu launched an intellectual counteroffensive. In his seminal essay titled On the Origin of the Tao, he articulated a conceptual framework that would reshape East Asian thought for the next millennium. Known as the orthodox lineage of the Wei, he asserted a sacred chain of custody, passed from Yao to Shun, to Yu, to Tang, to the kings Wen and Wu, and the Duke of Zhou, then to Confucius, and finally to Mencius. Han Yu argued that this supreme lineage was broken upon the death of Mencius. This was a breathtakingly audacious claim, because it positioned Mencius as the solitary, legitimate heir to Confucius, rendering all other scholars disqualified. Han Yu elevated Mencius because he recognized an aggressive, unyielding spirit missing in other Confucian thinkers. Mencius famously declared, "If I find my cause to be righteous, I shall march forward, even against thousands upon thousands." This fierce defiance provided the exact intellectual armor Han Yu needed to combat the rival faiths. Through this aggressive rediscovery, Mencius was thrust directly into the ideological vanguard of Confucianism. By the Northern Song dynasty, the political reformer Wang Anshi weaponized this newfound reverence. A man driven by a radical vision of state transformation, Wang found his theoretical justification in the mentioned concept of expediency, the belief that one must not be bound by rigid dogmas, but must adapt dynamically to changing realities. Under Wang's immense political influence, an institutional mutation occurred in the year 1071, when the Mencius was officially canonized as a mandatory subject for the imperial civil service examinations. For any historical text, this was the ultimate upgrade in systemic power. During the Southern Song, Zhu Shi, the great synthesizer of Neo-Confucianism, delivered the final coronation. He bound the Mencius together with the Analects, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean, creating the canonized four books. From that moment on, the text became the absolute core of the imperial examinations, and its authority surpassed even the five classics that had reigned supreme since the Han and Tang dynasties. Finally, in the year 1330, during the Yuan dynasty, Mencius was formally enfeoffed as the Duke of the Second Sage. From then on, history would know him simply as the Second Sage, his position immutably secure, and second only to Confucius himself. Yet the sharp ideological thorns within the Mencius continued to agonize absolute rulers. Centuries later, upon reading the famous dictum that the people are of supreme value, the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, erupted in a violent rage. "If this old man were alive today," the emperor declared, "I would punish him without mercy." In a fit of imperial fury, he ordered Mencius's spirit tablet cast out of the Confucian temple. He then decreed a systematic censorship of the text, purging 85 passages deemed treasonous and heretical, to compile a castrated textbook for the examinations. But this sanitized version could not suppress the original text for long. The full and unedited masterpiece eventually triumphed and was restored. The empire could banish the tablets and censor the pages, but it could never extinguish the flame of his thought. For the ultimate truths of Mencius had already become foundational steel in the spine of Chinese civilization. Reflecting on the life of Mencius, a striking contrast emerges. Confucius was surrounded by 3,000 disciples, with 72 canonized as great sages. Zunzi cultivated titans like Li Si and Han Fizi, men whose ruthless statecraft rewrote the very map of history. Yet among the disciples of Mencius, few achieved historical immortality. The life of Mencius was a solitary war, but he was never a detached hermit, lost in self-absorbed isolation. He marched into the courts of warring kings to cross-examine absolute power face to face. He dragged the marginalized Confucian doctrine back into the ferocious arena of mainstream thought. He failed to alter the bloody ambitions of a single contemporary warlord, but he permanently re-engineered the moral spine of Chinese intellectuals for over a millennium. When the Song reformer Wang Anshi weaponized his radical revolutions, he famously declared, "Portents in heaven are not to be feared. Ancestral traditions are not to be blindly followed. The opinions of men are not to be pitied." Behind this defiance stood the shadow of Mencius. When Zhu Yuanzhang read the radical text and erupted in imperial fury, it was the living spirit of Mencius he was violently confronting. And when the late Ming philosopher Huang Zongxi penned his revolutionary treatise Waiting for the Dawn, boldly asserting that the world is the master and the sovereign is merely a guest, Mencius remained the ultimate fountainhead of his ideology. He was like a sacred sword. Its razor-sharp edge pointed directly at the throat of kings, while its hilt was placed into the open hands of the common people. Over 2,000 years ago, he used a single devastating question to pierce through the arrogance of those sitting on high thrones. Do you truly view your people as human beings of flesh and blood? Even today, that question has lost none of its piercing relevance. In the golden age of 100 competing schools of thought, Confucianism was perhaps not the sharpest sword on the battlefield, but Mencius was undeniably the toughest steel of that blade. And that sword, across 2,000 years, remains forever unsheathed.